Hi and welcome to the Hot Seat, brought to you by Sri Lanka Insurance. With me today, renowned architect and author Channa Daswatte.
Sri Lanka Insurance Motor Plus, driven by you.
Hi Channa, thanks for being with us.
Hi Tracy, nice to be here.
Thank you. Now, I'm just going to introduce you very briefly,
All
okay?
right.
Tell me if I miss anything.
Okay.
Right. So, Channa Daswatte is the chairperson of the Geoffrey Bawa Trust and the Uganda Trust. He joined Geoffrey Bawa's architectural practice in 1991 and was the last partner of the firm. Then in 1998, along with Murad Ismail, he founded MICD Associates, and he's a principal there. Channa has also served as the chairperson of the Gaul Heritage Foundation and has over the years worked on several projects that are architectural or conservationist or curatorial in nature. In 2015, he participated in an exhibition called Corridors of Power, in which he collaborated with constitutional lawyer Asanga Velikala on a project that is extremely intriguing and which I hope to find out a little bit more about as I talk to Channa. And having said all that, time now to speak with Channa about what he has been up to recently. And I have to tell you that he's just flown back from Uganda. And I'm going to let you hear from Channa what he has been doing there.
Well, I go to Uganda from time to time,
Right.
And it's really for work for a very dear friend and whose family live in Uganda. His parents lived there for many, many years. They're of Indian descent, of course, like there are many East Africans of Indian descent.
Mm-hmm.
And the project, of course, is a really interesting one because it's sort of making additions and maybe conserving and looking after a beautiful Art Deco house. What I would call East African or African Art Deco, dating to the 1940s, I think, 30s and 40s. And interestingly, it was used as the set for a very lovely film called The Last King of Scotland about Idi Amin, and it's really quite intriguing to be in that situation because it wasn't Idi Amin's house at all in real life.
Yeah.
But it does have a part to play in the history of that country because in 1972, when the Indian population was asked to leave,
Yeah.
These people had to leave this beautiful house. And 10 years on, what was lovely about the whole situation was that they were given it back, almost intact, but with this extraordinary time warp of an interior, with beautiful furniture from the 1960s and things like that. Which is why it was used in the movie, because it was just in a time warp.
Yeah.
Because once they got the sugar plantation it was associated with and the house back, they didn't change much because they had to put their money in other places.
Right.
So the house remained with this crazy sort of Art Deco house with a 1960s interior.
Oh my.
With old sort of heels and habitat furniture and
Yeah.
beautiful pieces people had bought in the 60s. So yes, so that's where I've been.
That must have been a delight for you to walk in there and see all that.
For me, absolutely, because of my interest in conservation.
Yeah.
Not just of the ancient past, but of the present past,
Yeah, sure.
the current past, which is really a lot of what we do with the Geoffrey Bawa Trust as well.
Yeah.
Like moving that De Silva house. That's about
Yes.
the recent past.
I mean,
And I'm really interested in that.
yeah, tell us about the Ina de Silva house, because I read that and I thought, wow, that's like amazing. I was going to ask you, like, why did you decide to do that?
Well, I think the key to doing that was that we in our country particularly don't pay enough attention to our recent history.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, we have a fantastic ancient history. There's no question about it, and right on until the 19th century. But somehow, in the work of the 20th century, seems to be neglected.
Yeah.
Or maybe even sort of seen to be positively against the the rhythms and notions of what we think of ourselves, and there is a bit of a problem there. So our recent history is neglected. There are so many beautiful buildings. For instance, Minette de Silva, hardly any of her work is even existent now.
Yeah.
And she was a very, very important modern architect.
And people have been trying slowly
People
to
have
sort of
been
restore her reputation.
Yes, indeed.
Give her a place
her
in the
work
history.
has just disappeared.
Uh-huh.
And this would have been the case with the Ina de Silva house. But fortunately, the Institute of Architects wrote to the newspapers and made a bit of a hue and cry and said, this is one of Geoffrey Bawa's most important houses. You can't possibly destroy it.
Yeah.
Because it was to be sold to the neighbors who were going to destroy that, remove the house. And today you'll see a car park there. But fortunately, the minister then listened to this and I think put a stay order on any demolition. The sale could go through, but you couldn't demolish the house. But that meant that the sale wouldn't go through. And that's when the trust stepped in, along with Amila Dimel, who was the architect, a very dear friend and a friend of Mr. Bawa's, who worked in the office. We all stepped in, and we convinced the government that, well, if we were to dismantle and rebuild it, would they allow the land to be sold? And I remember Sunetra Bandaranaike, who was then chairman of our trust, and going up and speaking to the then officials, and they agreed. And that's what we did. And for me, it also came because a friend of mine said, well, I'll pay for it.
Yeah.
And there it was. And we just made that call.
What a great friend.
He didn't. Eventually, it didn't happen that way, but it gave us the courage to say yes to something that had never been done before. And I think, I'm quite passionate about our contemporary history.
Yes.
And that I think is very important.
Yeah. Okay, there's two ways we can go now. One is this notion of what you were talking about conserving things. And I've been thinking about Colombo a lot recently. A lot of old buildings just vanishing, or, there's some facade put in front of it and it's something else. How do you feel about conservation in Colombo? We're trying to deal with now being this burgeoning metropolis. And so you get more and more residential areas just, becoming more mercantile. And you have all these old houses and things being converted into, hotels or bars or restaurants or whatever.
Well, I think the conversion, reuse is really one of the ways forward. Definitely for all buildings, reuse, and it's been done across the world. In terms of neighborhoods, which is really what cities are made of, single buildings are single buildings, and you might just look at it and that's fine.
Right.
But the identities of cities are made from neighborhoods.
Yeah.
About the pattern of housing that's in a particular neighborhood and so on. So if you go to any of the great cities of the world, you kind of see, you go down to, I suppose, Knightsbridge or something in London, and you just see this certain kind of house, and that's the neighborhood. That's the neighborhood of that city, and that's the feel of the city. Colombo is losing much of it.
Yeah.
But it's not like we haven't had precedents. For instance, in 1974, when preparations were being made for the Non-Aligned Summit Conference, there was a whole lot of beautiful houses that were part of Police Park and that area behind Police Park in Colombo. And they decided that they would like to build a whole lot of new accommodation for the armies of press that was going to be there.
Yeah.
And they needed accommodation. They didn't have hotels in Sri Lanka at the time. I think all the heads of state were put up at the new Lanka Oberoi, which was built by Skidmore, Wings and Merrill.
Okay.
But for the others, for the lesser officials, they required housing. And Turner Wickramasinghe, who had worked with Geoffrey Bawa many years before, was then the chief architect of the State Engineering Corporation. And they came up with this interesting idea, what is now known as the Summit Flats, to build between these beautiful old houses.
Right.
So the general feel of the neighborhood wasn't going to change. The huge trees would remain, the beautiful houses would remain, but they would build in between, 3-4 story buildings that would sort of that would densify the neighborhood. Now, in Sri Lanka, we have things that people have done to try and conserve neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And I think we need to learn from them. I don't know whether, how many of us actually know about this, about how they tried to conserve this neighborhood through a particular kind of building. I think it's important we know about these things.
So what are you seeing that is lacking in that kind of planning today?
I think in the end, it's whether we take these old buildings to be important in the history of our country and the history of our makeup of who we are.
Yeah.
Are we taking it seriously? Do we think it's important to have these buildings as part of our history?
Because once they go,
they're gone.
And you're erasing some things. No matter how much you photograph something, it's never the same as actually reaching out and touching it.
Exactly.
So aren't we then also erasing
our
history?
You have fantastic projects like the one that the Independence Arcade, which are beautifully conserved.
Yeah.
Single complex, and I think that's great. I think that's wonderful. I really hats off to the UDA and the young architect who actually worked on it. And you have similar sort of situations in which the old Dutch hospital was conserved and so on. But they still seem to be single building complexes rather than neighborhoods. And cities really get their identity from neighborhoods. And that's where we need to be a little bit more careful. We have very, very little left. And I hope, we are much more conscious about all of those.
Here's something that could just be taking us just that little bit further in, is with places like the Dutch Hospital and the Independence Arcade, not so much, but also that, the fortress of kites in Jaffa that was restored as a hotel, as a 5-star hotel or something. Yes. The buildings that have a dark history, a history of violence, and where, some of the worst crimes, say, of our civil conflict have been perpetrated. Where do you stand on that? Like, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's part of our history. It's important that we remember that we are capable of such atrocities. You and I are capable of such atrocities that we probably stood by as these things happened. Yeah. And it's important that it's there, it's part of our history. The fact that it was made into a hotel is fine, but the building is still there. Now that has a very, very interesting history. It was a Dutch fortress, and under the Dutch there would have been horrible atrocities. That's what I mean.
Like, I'm not talking just our recent history either.
It's year after year. And then I know of a wonderful moment when the archaeological department apparently used to rent it or lease it to people who would look after it. And Ina de Silva and Lucky Senanayake once rented Hammond Hill.
Oh my
And they lived there for about 4 years. Ina would talk of wonderful moments when they would go there. I think the architect Ismet Rahim knows about it as well. And they would talk about sort of making this furniture out of Paremara wood and living this kind of crazy life on Hammond Hill and looking after the fort. And what a lovely idea that you are given a ruin to look after it, and in return for you being able to use it. And there you are. So it's got a history that's
what a jewel of a story that is.
If you put down the history of Hammond Hill, that would be part of it.
Yeah.
And there were moments of great joy, and there were absolute moments of despair.
Yeah.
And that's what buildings are about, aren't they? It's the lives that are lived in them. The object is what you look at, but the life that was lived in it, the moments of joy and the moments of despair are all what that building is. And I think it's important that they remind us of all of that.
But now you are, I'm sorry, I don't know if you've finished or not, but you are restoring is not quite the right word, the Benthode Beach Hotel.
Well, we finished.
Right.
We finished just before the pandemic, so that's probably why you don't feel that it's finished.
Right.
The Benthode Beach is an interesting story because, of course, it was, if you look at the Bawa exhibition, it was kind of the final sort of effort of Geoffrey Bawa and his team in this search for this idea of the boundary and how you sort of protect a building, give it shade and so on. And it was perhaps the first of those star-class hotels that were built in a style and fashion that was somehow connected to Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And I think when it was built in 1968 or 69, it was actually quite miraculous. It was an utterly beautiful experience.
I visited it as a child in the 80s.
There you are.
And fell in love with it. It was so beautiful.
So somewhere in 2015, 2016, John Keels came to us. We were doing a lot of hotel work for them, restoring, cleaning, and we were building a new one as well. And they came up to me and said, Channa, I think Bento the Beach next, and what do you think we should do? I mean, so we did a sort of survey of the whole place, and we found that in fact, after 50 years, the concrete from the inside had deteriorated. And short of very, very expensive concrete treatment, the building really had to go. It had to be demolished. And so the thing was, well, Channa, then let's demolish it and build something else, because we are cinnamon and we require to change the whole aspect of what that hotel was. The rooms were small and all of that. And so it was kind of, it was very tempting. Knock it all off and let's start anew.
Yeah.
But then again, the history buff in me sort of tiny little voice saying, how could you? How could you? And how could I? I mean, here was a very, very important building that had been built by, not just because it's Geoffrey Bawa, but because it had been built through investigation into how we should build in this country. And it had such an extraordinary, the Bento the Beach was the Bento the Beach, I mean, and so on. And it wasn't like the people at John Keels said, let's conserve it.
Okay.
I had to make a case for conserving it because it was going to cost. And
Of
all they
course.
were going to get was the same old building. And how would you conserve it? And I think it was important to also show that it was part of the cultural history of this country. So I remember one of my colleagues found this snippet of a song that had been filmed at the Bento the Beach.
Right.
And the song was Ma Prarthana Itueva by Premsiri Kemadasa.
Yeah.
And I remember the film, I can't remember the name of the film, but I know the producer was Manik Sandrasagar, my old friend. And I used that in the presentation and said, you can't ignore this. This is part of the cultural history of this country.
Right.
Here is a popular film that has been filmed here. So it has gone into the psyche of our people. So it's important that we conserve this. And I think what I did was I sort of showed the drawings of what it might be.
Right.
And I ended with this. And it drew a laugh, of course.
Yeah.
I say, oh my God, what are you doing? And I said, that's the point. The point is that here it is a part of the cultural history of modern Sri Lanka. And so we need to conserve it. And that's what we did.
I mean,
So
it's great that you were able to do that, but also in a way that you had to go to extreme lengths for people to understand the importance of conserving things like that. Is that a challenge that you face more recently, or has it always been a challenge?
I think it's always been a challenge about recent buildings.
Okay.
And I think that's really what the point is. It's like, you
And when you say recent, you mean 20th century?
well, mid-20th century
onwards.
Yeah.
Like 40s onwards.
Yes, because somehow the notion of modern in today's context, in the politics of Sri Lanka today, is kind of seen as reactionary. And I think it's not supported. Like modern art, for instance, is not really supported. I mean, yes, a lot of the modern artists did sort of talk about the conflict, the war, and so on. And so modern art is equated with protest.
Yes, it is, very much so.
And that's really one of the things.
Because the moment you say that, I think of artists, and I'm immediately thinking of like
but that's not what modern. But that's not what modern. That's not the only modern art.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, modern art really represents us as we are today. Yes, some of us will protest. There are others who talk about other things. And I think, there's a show going on at the moment at Crescat Boulevard, the MMCA
The
show,
Encounter.
the Encounter show, where it's not about protest. It's about, I mean, in fact, it starts with the idea of the non-aligned movement.
Yes.
I mean, the first parts of it are really about trying to understand ourselves and how we represent ourselves as a non-aligned country.
Yeah.
And I think that's very, very important. And I think they have 3 iterations of the exhibition.
Yeah.
The second, I think, looks at natural history in the contemporary world and so on. So I think we need to look at everything that we make today as well to understand ourselves. I mean, artists are in many ways a mirror to society. They make reflections of who we are.
Is that sort of part of the reason why the Trust is starting to do more and more work now?
Indeed.
Or what are the plans of the Bawa Trust?
Well, the Bawa Trust plans are that, I mean, we're more than 20 odd years old.
Yeah.
Geoffrey Bawa set it up a few years before he passed away. In 2023, it would be 20 years since he passed.
Wow.
But about 4 years ago, the Trust felt that we had reached a particular level of stability, that we should perhaps go beyond having the annual lectures and the triennial awards, that we should engage with the cultural landscape of the period that Geoffrey Bawa worked in, and from there into the future. So we hired this team, Shari, who was on air, I think, recently, and a whole team of young people who are curators and designers. And we started with celebrating Geoffrey Bawa's 100th anniversary, birth anniversary. And that was a project called The Gift, where we installed works by renowned international artists, people who would be normally shown at the Tate Modern in London or the Museum of Modern Art in New York, installed in Sri Lanka, in Geoffrey Bawa's garden, as a kind of interaction with Geoffrey, because Geoffrey's garden was really his kind of statement.
Yes.
And these artists, the project was for them to interact with the garden as though they were interacting with the architect.
Yeah.
So we had 5 works, 3 of them from outside the country. Kengo Kuma, the architect who made the pavilion, the Olympic Stadium for the Tokyo Olympics. He installed a pavilion. We had Lee Ming-wei, a renowned artist of Taiwanese and American heritage. He did this beautiful work of bells which caught the wind. It was called Zephyr's Breath. And the wind would sort of, it's like a massive.
I think I saw a video of that.
You probably did see that somewhere. And then we have Dayanita Singh, who made a photographic work. She's a very well-known Indian photographer. We had our own Dominic Sanzoni, who has been recording the garden for many years, recording it in a different way. And Chandrakipta Thenwara, who also intervened in part of the garden. So that was our first project, which was to bring international art that was right out there, up there, around the world, so that our people could interact with them. And so all of these artists were there. They spoke with us, and that was our first project. And from there, we've gone on to develop other things like the ETBT exhibition, where it's essential to be there. We hope to carry on with celebrating the 75th anniversary of the garden itself in 2023. The garden would have been in existence for 75 years, 20 of which was without Geoffrey, actually. And I feel really chuffed that we have managed to keep that garden going. And we are really grateful to everybody who goes to visit. And if anyone hasn't been to visit, I think they should. It's an extraordinary place. It's now run as a hotel, so you can always go and stay there as well. And all of that actually goes into a trust which supports all of this work. So the way we are structured is that we've got the Lunuganga Trust, which is the holding trust for all our assets, which does business. And all the profits go straight into the Geoffrey Bawa Trust, which does all the charitable and artwork, artists and all the work in the cultural scene. So that's what we do. It's a not-for-profit, because all of the profits, if there is any, are churned back into public purpose.
I do have one final question. It's a very long question, and I'm actually going to read it. This is about corridors of power. Now, Corridors of Power was an exhibition held in 2015. It was curated by Sanjana Hattotua. And I'm going to read how he described what he wanted it to be. And he says that it was an attempt to use the visual and spatial expression of architecture to visually depict as well as deconstruct locations of power as enshrined in our Constitution, right? And so he invited Channa to collaborate with a lawyer who's very famous for his knowledge of constitutional law, Dr. Asanga Walikala. And do you know, Channa, I went online and I tried to look for drawings or anything, but I didn't see a lot. So I'm curious to find out your working process and what you were thinking about when you went through that. Because this is what Sanjana says of the collaboration between you and Asanga Walikala. And he says, the exhibition clearly demonstrates the futility of even more amendments to a constitution that since conception in 1978 was deeply flawed. It highlights the outgrowth of authoritarianism and the illusion of stability. It gives life to the phrase, the center cannot hold. Through errors thrown up by the architectural program Autodesk Revit, significant flaws of our present constitution are clearly flagged. The models will collapse over time. The drawings are increasingly grotesque. The architectural output makes abundantly clear the failure of our constitutional vision.
I think yes. I mean, that's actually high praise. For I don't know whether I went that far, but the process was very straightforward. My conversations with Asanga was really about understanding. See, constitutions are really about relationships between different entities that hold power.
Yeah.
And the best constitutions will hold them at reasonable issues, in a reasonable balance of each other.
Right.
And looking at various clauses in our constitution, the first Republican Constitution, that's the first model I made of 1972. We looked at that one, and then we looked at the second Republican the second Republican Constitution in 1978. And Asanga sort of worked out for me the various relationships between key elements that were part of the Constitution. Now, architecture is really, if any building is really about creating relationships between different groups of people. Like we are sitting here in this studio, and there's a relationship between us and the boss in this studio. Mm-hmm. Now, to get to him, we might need to go down a corridor and wait in a waiting room, right, and so on. And that begins to tell us something about the relationship between the people sitting in this studio and the boss of the studio, and so on. Now, that's a simple example that I'm trying to come up with. That's what architecture is about. Now, to facilitate that relationship is what architecture can do, right, by creating the kind of spaces you have between the two entities.
Yes.
Now, looking at the Constitution in that way, here are these different entities that make up the Constitution. And what are the relationships between them? How do you relate the president to the parliament and to the judiciary? How complex are the connections, or how easy are the connections? Now that can be represented in terms of space. And I began to try and look at each of these things and construct them. First as little sketches that I did, and then eventually as drawings. And then if you actually put some of these drawings into, I don't do them myself, my colleagues in office actually did one or two of them.
Right.
You really find the model sort of saying, no, this might
work.
not actually work because there's too much weight here, or these spaces don't actually fit
Right.
And you do need to have a door here, or you do need to have a level change here, or something like that. So through that process, we came up with a series of drawings and a series of models. And of course, by the 19th Amendment, or the last thing that we looked at, you had this extraordinary structure.
It says the drawings grow increasingly grotesque.
Yes, I mean, I thought they were beautiful, but, but it was
Shame on you, Sanjana.
Yes, but yes, I can understand the grotesqueness, because I mean, they were sort of either top heavy, or you had to sort of prop things up because they wouldn't otherwise sort of hold, and those things that you prop up with suddenly sort of creates the grotesque.
Right.
And I really enjoyed sort of working with both of them, actually. Yeah. Sanjana whipping us along.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure.
and Asanga, brilliant sort of analysis.
Yeah.
And it was a completely sort of apolitical sort of exercise. It was just simply looking at a document.
Well, it was looking at the 18th Amendment as well, wasn't it? Which repealed the 17th Amendment.
And so on, yes.
And the 17th Amendment basically had checks and balances. So the president couldn't nominate just anyone he wanted to hold positions of power. That was the 17th Amendment, which was repealed by the 18th Amendment, and then but the project was not so much to sort of look at it like, okay, how would you make a political critique? It was just simply to look at a document. How would you translate the relationships that are defined in that document? I don't know. I mean, lawyers may beg to differ, but I mean, I suppose I had Asanga on my side. I mean, he is a constitutional lawyer, so he worked out what those relationships might be, and I imagined the spatial sequences that would represent those relationships. Right.
And that would then become the building, the architecture. So it was a completely sort of, as I said, a sort of exercise in architecture.
So you have these different models.
Yes, so you had these different models to kind of compare and say, look, that's interesting. That's what this did. This is what this did. So, I mean, one of the most charming moments was when there was a guy who was, I think, visually impaired, who came in on the first day, and we allowed people to touch the models. That's one of the other things we did. The models were really so that people could touch them, and this guy touched them, and he kind of said, "Yes, I think I understand what you mean," and that was really lovely. And he says, "It doesn't this mean that this feels
doesn't feel right,
really not right," and that was really for me a moment. I mean, how you express things. I mean, sometimes a document like the Constitution, I mean, how many of us really care? We just kind of, there's a Constitution, or we go and say,
we care when suddenly something is repealed, and you're like, then everyone is an expert on the 17th and the 18th and the 19th.
But we don't really look at the whole document.
Yeah.
And this was really looking at it and seeing how it gets represented in a different way, in a visual way. So that people can...
It's more understandable. I would love to see them. Yes. And I heard that the last time it was exhibited, your work was in Dhaka in 2018.
And then later on in 2019, at the first MMCA show, which was at AOD on the 18th floor, when we opened the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art. You missed that.
I missed the second one.
Somewhere, I think I have... I think Sanjana probably has all the beautiful yellow paper drawings. Right. I mean, my work I usually sketch on yellow architectural, architectural detail paper, which has a lovely texture.
Okay.
That's there. We have the computer drawings and models somewhere in our computers somewhere, and the models are again somewhere hidden away in one of my storerooms, waiting for someone to want to display them.
Oh, won't you please display them? Okay, last question. Actually, in a previous interview, you stated that not every building is meant to be a monument, which is understandable. But, why is modern urban architecture so ugly? Now, I am opposite a building that's coming up. It looks like a radiator. It's grey and it's got those radiator bumps on it, and it's just squat, fat, grey and black thing.
Gosh, you're body shaming the poor building.
That is sort of just blocking my view. Why are they so ugly, Chan?
Why are they so ugly? I think that's a very philosophical debate which I don't want to start here. The notion of what is beauty and what is ugly.
You into trouble and myself into trouble also.
Yes, I mean, I think, yeah, that's a very long debate, and perhaps that's another whole show. But I think what it is that while I go back to this idea that not every building needs to be a monument, but it becomes a monument because each of us as architects wants to make our mark on this city.
Yeah.
So we, plus also maybe some of our clients, wants to make a mark, kind of to say, look, hey, I'm here. So all that building, the radiator that's going to be built in front of you is doing, is actually screaming at you. It's doing exactly what you see.
What it's about, but like
it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
I am not sending good vibes towards
good or bad.
I'm sending very bad vibes
but
towards it. But
you are noticing it. You're noticing it, you're talking about it.
Obscuring my skyline.
It is, but you are noticing it, you're talking about it. And in many ways...
Only to you.
Well, I mean, you're now talking to your audience. Because that's what it is. And that's what buildings sometimes do. They want to stand out. And now,
the thugs.
Well, but the thing is, when everyone next to each other wants to stand out,
then you need to be
then
a thug.
the city becomes a cacophony, with everyone screaming in different tones and different voices.
Right.
And then the city becomes ugly. And that's really one of the problems, that each one wants to be different.
Yes.
They're not content with putting a little board to say, I am TNL Radio. They want to say, I am TNL Radio.
Yes.
And then the building becomes
yes.
the message. And when every building next to each other is a different message, it does not create a neighborhood, it does not create a city. It just creates a cacophony.
Yes, I do worry. I really hope it doesn't happen to us.
It is happening, and it will happen. I mean, the Gaul Road is a cacophony of
that's what I mean.
Visual cacophony.
Yes.
Of ugliness.
Don't build ugliness. Call Channa and do it properly.
Channa doesn't do
that kind of thing.
That sort of thing.
But call Murad. Maybe Murad might.
No, but the reality is
just get help.
And
that's the reality.
Well, also not many people, think an architect can make a difference, and architects can. Because what happens is you kind of say, well, all I need is this sort of board, this screaming signboard. So you might probably just get a contractor and just say, why don't you do this? And they would just do that, and not think of the context in which they're building and so on. So that's really one of the problems. I think, I don't know if I'm wrong, but apparently only 10 or 15% of the buildings in this country are built by architects. Everything else is
everyone's
just done.
Building.
It's just building.
Willy-nilly.
Yeah. And that's really one of the problems.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed that once you visit the Geoffrey Bawa exhibition, everyone gets a better taste for the sensibilities. Like, that's one thing I find is like, build for this country, for this climate, for our culture, instead of building radiators. And on that note, Channa, it has been really lovely chatting with you. I could just sit here chatting to you for ages, but I think we're losing goodwill. Thanks for watching The Hot Seat. Please make sure to like and subscribe and follow us on all our social media.
Sri Lanka Insurance Motor Plus, driven by you.